Picture the richest country on Earth. You're probably imagining oil fields stretching to the horizon, or gleaming skyscrapers packed with tech billionaires, or diamond mines running deep into the earth. You're probably imagining something enormous, something powerful, something loud. Now imagine instead a place smaller than the state of Rhode Island, a quiet little country with rolling green hills, medieval castles, and a population smaller than the city of Louisville, Kentucky. A country that most people couldn't find on a map without help. That country is Luxembourg, and its GDP per capita, the amount of wealth produced per person each year, sits at around $143,000. That is more than double what the United Kingdom produces per person. More than double France, nearly 3 times the global average. Luxembourg is officially the richest country on the planet. And it didn't get there with oil. It didn't get there with technology. It got there with something far stranger and far more controversial. Empty offices. Rooms full of brass nameplates bolted to doors. Companies with no employees, no factories, no products, just a legal address and trillions of dollars of other people's money quietly flowing through them every single day. This is the story of how one tiny nation figured out a trick that the entire financial world now copies. How it got rich by hosting wealth it didn't own, and what that actually means for the rest of us. To understand what Luxembourg became, you first need to understand what it was. For most of its history, Luxembourg was a country defined almost entirely by one thing: iron. The southern part of the country, a region called Minette, sat on top of one of the largest iron ore deposits in Western Europe. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard, dangerous, physical work. Miners and steel workers from Luxembourg and from waves of immigrants arriving from Italy, then Portugal, then Germany and Belgium, descended into the mines and stood at the furnaces and built an entire economy on molten metal. By the 1950s, steel wasn't just part of Luxembourg's economy, it was the economy. The steel sector alone accounted for roughly a quarter to a third of the country's entire GDP. The company Arbed, which stands for the Aciérie Réunie de Burbach-Eich-du-Delange, was Luxembourg's industrial crown jewel. It employed 25,000 people in a country whose total population at the time was only around 300,000. You couldn't separate Luxembourg from steel any more than you could separate Scotland from whiskey or Saudi Arabia from oil. The entire social structure of the southern towns revolved around the steelworks. The school schedules were built around the shift rotations. The local culture, the food, the community festivals, all of it was drenched in the smell of burning metal and industrial smoke. And then the world changed, and steel wasn't enough anymore. Beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, the global steel industry collapsed into crisis. Competition from cheaper producers in Asia began undercutting European prices. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 drove energy costs through the roof, making European steel production ruinously expensive. New construction materials were reducing demand. Mills that had roared at full capacity for decades began to slow and then stop. Workers who had expected to spend their entire lives in the same factory found themselves out of work in their 40s and 50s, with no obvious alternative. By 1980, steel's share of Luxembourg's GDP had fallen from roughly 30% to just 12%. By 2011, it would shrink to barely 2%. The industry that had built Luxembourg was dying, and everybody in the tiny country could feel it happening. But here's the thing about Luxembourg that makes its story so remarkable. Its leaders saw the steel crisis coming before it fully arrived. And rather than simply hoping it would pass or waiting for someone else to provide a solution, they made one of the most aggressive and unconventional economic bets in modern European history. They decided to become a financial center. Now, on the surface, this sounds perfectly reasonable. Lots of countries try to build financial sectors. Not many succeed in becoming genuine global powerhouses. What made Luxembourg different was the combination of timing, geography, and a very particular willingness to write rules that other countries refused to write. Luxembourg sat in the absolute heart of Western Europe, sharing borders with France, Germany, and Belgium, three of the largest and most powerful economies on the continent. It was a founding member of the European Economic Community, the organization that would eventually become the European Union. It was small enough that decisions could be made quickly, without the slow, grinding bureaucracy that paralyzed larger governments. And crucially, in the 1960s, it spotted a gap in the global financial system that nobody else had quite noticed yet. That gap was the euro-dollar market. After World War II, enormous quantities of US dollars had accumulated in European banks. Dollars that American companies and governments had spent abroad, that were now sitting in financial institutions across Europe. American law restricted how these dollars could be used inside the United States, but outside American borders, they were essentially free money looking for a home. Luxembourg moved aggressively to attract that money. In 1965, the country passed a formal banking law that established a clear, transparent, and importantly, very welcoming licensing regime for international banks. Within a few years, international banks from across Europe and beyond were setting up Luxembourg offices. The financial sector was still modest, but the foundations were being poured for something much larger. The real transformation, the one that explains why Luxembourg is richer today than almost anywhere else on the planet, came from a concept that sounds almost too simple to be true. What if you could attract wealth without attracting the actual economic activity that creates it? What if you could build a legal address that billions of dollars flow through without requiring those billions to generate local jobs, local factories, or local production? What if the paperwork itself could become an industry? This is what Luxembourg built over the following decades. Through a combination of carefully designed tax laws, secret agreements with individual companies, and a regulatory framework that was friendly to foreign corporations in ways that most European countries refused to be, Luxembourg turned itself into one of the world's great financial pass-through economies. The model worked roughly like this. A giant multinational corporation, say a company that sells products across all of Europe, would set up a subsidiary in Luxembourg. This subsidiary would exist on paper. It would have an office address, perhaps a single boardroom, a small number of directors listed on the company registration, and very little else. The subsidiary would own valuable things like patents, brand names, or intellectual property rights. Then the company's profitable European operations would pay licensing fees to the Luxembourg subsidiary for the right to use those patents and brand names. The fees would drain profit out of high-tax countries like France or Germany or Italy, where the real sales were happening, and move it into Luxembourg, where the tax rates on certain kinds of income were extraordinarily low. The money effectively evaporated from the tax authorities of the countries where it was actually earned, reappearing cleaned and reduced inside a quiet office in Luxembourg City. Amazon ran a version of this system for years, using royalty payments to a Luxembourg shell company to effectively shelter 3/4 of its European profits from higher tax rates elsewhere. IKEA channeled money through Luxembourg structures. Pepsi did it. Disney built Luxembourg arrangements. Hundreds of the world's most recognizable brands quietly maintained Luxembourg subsidiaries that existed primarily to move money, not to make anything. The law firms and accounting giants, the Big Four of PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young, built massive Luxembourg offices specifically to help corporations design and manage these arrangements. PricewaterhouseCoopers alone was bringing in over $150 million in annual revenue from its Luxembourg operations. The man at the center of this system, the civil servant who personally reviewed and approved the secret tax agreements between Luxembourg and global corporations, was a quietly powerful government official whose name almost nobody outside Luxembourg had ever heard: Marius Kohl. For decades, Kohl operated a department called Société 6, a tiny unit within the Luxembourg tax authority where the deals were made. Companies would come in, their lawyers would present a proposed tax structure, and Kohl would agree to it in writing. These written agreements were called tax rulings. They were private, they were binding, and they guaranteed that whatever tax rate the company had negotiated would hold, regardless of what happened elsewhere. The system worked because Luxembourg's prime minister for much of this period was a man named Jean-Claude Juncker, who understood finance deeply, believed fiercely in Luxembourg's right to compete for global capital, and created the political environment in which Société 6 could operate without interference. The entire arrangement might have continued indefinitely, quietly enriching Luxembourg while draining tax revenue from the rest of Europe, had it not been for a young Frenchman named Antoine Deltour. Deltour was a junior auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Luxembourg, a 20-something who had come to the country to build his career. What he found when he started working on client files disturbed him deeply. Most of PwC's Luxembourg clients, he would later explain, were just empty shells. Companies with no employees, no real operations, only financial transactions designed to shift profits into Luxembourg, where they paid almost no tax anywhere. Deltour began copying documents. In 2014, those documents, over 28,000 pages of them, reached the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The story that broke was called LuxLeaks, and it landed like a bomb in the middle of European politics. The most damaging detail was not just what the documents revealed about corporate tax avoidance. It was who was in charge of Luxembourg when the deals were being made. Jean-Claude Juncker, the man who had signed off on the country's entire tax strategy for decades, had just been appointed President of the European Commission, the most powerful administrative position in the European Union. The man running Europe's executive branch was the architect of a tax system that had been quietly draining the treasuries of Europe's member states for years. But here is where the story takes its most surprising turn. The LuxLeaks scandal was real, and its consequences were real. Luxembourg faced enormous pressure from the European Union and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to reform its most aggressive tax practices. And it did reform them, gradually, reluctantly, but meaningfully. The era of the most generous secret tax deals quietly wound down. And yet Luxembourg's GDP per capita kept rising. Its financial sector kept growing. The country remained, year after year, the richest in the world per person. How? Because the shell company trick was only one part of the story. The deeper, more enduring, and more legitimate part of Luxembourg's wealth machine was something far less controversial: investment funds. In 1985, the European Union created a new regulatory framework called UCITS, which stands for Undertakings for Collective Investment in Transferable Securities. In plain language, UCITS was a set of rules that allowed investment funds, the kind of pooled investment vehicles that hold the retirement savings and pensions of ordinary people around the world, to be created in one European country and sold to investors across all of Europe using a single license. It was a passport for investment funds. If your fund was properly regulated and registered in one EU member state, it could be marketed legally to investors in every other EU member state without going through a separate approval process in each country. Luxembourg saw what this meant before anyone else did. In 1988, when the UCITS directive came into effect, Luxembourg was the first country in Europe to transpose it into national law. The country moved faster than France, faster than Germany, faster than the United Kingdom, faster than everyone. And because it moved first, it attracted the first wave of global asset managers who needed a European home for their funds. And because those first managers came to Luxembourg, they built expertise in Luxembourg. They trained accountants and lawyers and fund administrators in Luxembourg. They created an infrastructure of specialized services that made it easier for the next wave of managers, and the next, and the next. Today, the result of that 30-year head start is staggering in scale. Luxembourg manages approximately 7.3 trillion euros in investment fund assets. That is 7,300 billion euros flowing through the financial structures of a country the size of a small American county. Luxembourg is the second largest fund management center in the entire world, behind only the United States. It handles 55% of all cross-border investment funds globally. 70% of the world's 50 largest asset management firms have chosen Luxembourg as their primary European fund domicile. A third of all European UCITS funds sit in Luxembourg. Funds registered in Luxembourg are distributed to investors in more than 80 countries around the world. And because Luxembourg law requires much of the actual legal and administrative work around these funds to be done in Luxembourg, there are real jobs, real offices, real employees processing real transactions every single day. The model is elegant in a way the tax ruling system never quite was. Luxembourg isn't hiding anything with its fund industry. It's genuinely providing a service, a stable, well-regulated, EU passport-enabled platform for global investors to access European markets efficiently. The money is real, the infrastructure is real, the expertise is real, and the wealth it generates is real. But here's where the story gets philosophically interesting and a little uncomfortable. Because when you look at Luxembourg's extraordinary GDP per capita figure, you have to ask a question that most people forget to ask. Per capita means per person, but which people exactly are we counting? Luxembourg has a population of around 680,000 residents, but those residents only account for about half of the country's workforce. The other half, almost 228,000 people as of 2023, commutes into Luxembourg every single day from France, Belgium and Germany, and then drives home every evening. In French, these workers have a name, frontalier, which means border people. They work in Luxembourg's banks, its law firms, its fund administration offices. They produce the economic output that gets counted in Luxembourg's GDP. But they don't live in Luxembourg. Their housing costs, their children's schools, their healthcare in the evenings and on weekends, all of it is paid for in France or Germany or Belgium. Luxembourg gets the economic production. The neighboring countries get the social costs. This creates a statistical effect that is genuinely extraordinary. When Luxembourg's GDP is divided by its resident population, the resulting number is inflated because a huge portion of the wealth being produced is being made by people who are not Luxembourg residents. The IMF and other international economists have noted this distortion explicitly. Luxembourg's GDP per capita is not so much a measure of how rich Luxembourgers are, as it is a measure of how much economic value passes through Luxembourg's territory per resident. Those are related but very different things. The average Luxembourg resident does earn significantly more than the average European. The country does have excellent schools, good hospitals, well-maintained infrastructure, and a genuinely high standard of living. But the gap between Luxembourg and everyone else is partly a statistical artifact of counting the output of hundreds of thousands of workers who clock out at 5 o'clock and drive back into France. By the 2000s and 10s, the combination of LuxLeaks and a global push toward tax reform was creating real pressure on Luxembourg's model. the OECD launched a massive international project called BEPS, which stands for Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, designed to close the loopholes that allowed companies to drain profits from the countries where they were actually earned. The European Union moved to harmonize corporate tax rules, and eventually, in a landmark global agreement in 2021, the G20 nations agreed to implement a minimum global corporate tax rate of 15%. This agreement, which began coming into effect in the years following, was specifically designed to make countries like Luxembourg less attractive as tax minimization destinations. Luxembourg's response was instructive. Rather than fighting the reforms or collapsing into economic crisis, the country adapted. It shifted its emphasis from pure tax arbitrage toward legitimate, regulated financial services. It invested in becoming a center for sustainable finance, launching the world's first dedicated green bond exchange platform in 2016. It positioned itself as a hub for fintech and digital assets, passing 4 successive blockchain laws that created one of the most advanced legal frameworks for digital financial instruments in Europe. And it leaned even harder into its investment fund industry, which was large enough, legitimate enough, and genuinely useful enough to survive the reform era largely intact. The country also began to benefit from a new wave of financial migration. After the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union in 2016, financial firms that had used London as their European hub suddenly needed an alternative. Luxembourg, with its EU membership, its existing financial infrastructure, its multilingual workforce, and its regulatory expertise, was perfectly positioned to absorb a significant portion of that displaced activity. Banks, insurance companies, and investment managers began relocating European operations from London to Luxembourg. The Brexit that many worried might harm Luxembourg's position actually accelerated its growth. So what is the lesson that the world is supposed to take from Luxembourg's extraordinary, complicated, and somewhat morally ambiguous rise to the top of the global wealth rankings? There are several, and they push in different directions. The first lesson is about the power of being first. Luxembourg's dominance in investment funds doesn't come from being uniquely gifted or uniquely clever. It comes from being fastest. The country implemented the UCITS framework in 1988, while everyone else was still reading the directive. That single decision, made by a small team of government officials in a tiny country that most Europeans couldn't locate on a blank map, gave Luxembourg a 30-year head start that competitors have never fully closed. Being first to implement a useful new framework created expertise, which created infrastructure, which created reputation, which attracted more business, which deepened the expertise further. The circle kept spinning. First mover advantage in financial services is almost impossible to dislodge once it sets in. The second lesson is about geography weaponized by law. Luxembourg is at the center of Europe, which gives it a natural position. But dozens of countries are at the center of something. What made Luxembourg's central position powerful was what it did with it legally. The country used its position as a founding EU member and its freedom to set its own tax rules to create a platform that served the needs of global capital more efficiently than anywhere else. Location matters, but law matters more. The rules a country writes determine which kind of economic activity it attracts. The third lesson, and this one is darker, is about the difference between hosting wealth and creating it. For decades, Luxembourg hosted enormous quantities of wealth that was created elsewhere. The profits earned by Amazon's European customers, the intellectual property revenues of multinational brands, the fees paid by ordinary pension savers across the continent, all of it flowed through Luxembourg on its way to somewhere else. Luxembourg collected a fee for providing the address, the legal framework, and the infrastructure. This is a legitimate business, but it is not the same as the wealth created by building something, making something, or inventing something. Iceland's geothermal engineering expertise and Scotland's distilling knowledge created industries that belonged to those countries. Luxembourg's financial expertise, at its most aggressive, consisted largely of writing rules that let other people's money avoid paying taxes in the countries where it was genuinely earned. The LuxLeaks documents made that visible in a way that was uncomfortable for everyone, and the world's response, a global minimum tax and tighter regulations, suggests that the purely extractive version of the Luxembourg model has a natural ceiling. Today, if you walk through Luxembourg City, you will see something that most financial capitals cannot offer: a genuinely beautiful place. Medieval battlements rising above the Alzette River Gorge. Wide boulevards lined with the headquarters of international banks and law firms. A calm, ordered, multilingual city where French, German, Luxembourgish and English are all spoken within a single lunch meeting. The EU's Court of Justice, its audit body, and major EU institutions sit here, lending the tiny country a weight in European governance that no country of its size would normally possess. The empty offices are still here too, in a sense. The buildings, full of company names and no employees, have been partially cleaned up by reform, but the fundamental structure that allows trillions of dollars of investment capital to call Luxembourg home, while the actual investment decisions are made in New York and London and Singapore, has not gone away. It has simply become more regulated, more transparent, and more compliant with international standards. The financial center remains the country's economic spine. The fund industry, with its 7 trillion euros in assets, is not going anywhere. The expertise built over 3 decades is real and deep and genuinely difficult to replicate. Luxembourg's story is ultimately a story about what a small country can do when it refuses to be defined by its limitations. No oil, no vast agricultural land, no port, no great industrial heritage comparable to Britain or Germany. What it had was a central location, a founding seat at the European table, and a willingness to write rules that other countries were too proud or too powerful to write. Whether those rules were always fair is a question that history has begun to answer. Whether the wealth they generated was real is a question that requires a more careful answer than the GDP statistics suggest. What is beyond question is that a country smaller than Rhode Island, sitting at the intersection of 3 major European nations, figured out how to make money flow through its laws the way water flows through a pipe. And for a country of 680,000 people sitting on medieval rock in the heart of Europe, that turned out to be enough to make it the richest place on earth. Not because of what it dug up, not because of what it built, but because of what it wrote down, stamped in official ink, and offered to anyone willing to open an office with a brass nameplate on the door.